The forest where time grows like moss. Welcome to Fantasy Journeys. Today, somewhere north of where the birch trees stop and the older forest begins, the ground is covered in moss so thick it holds the cold like a second sky beneath your feet. The air there carries pine resin and damp stone, and something underneath both of those, older, quieter, a smell that has no name because no one ever thought to give it one. And the moss, in the deepest parts of the forest, glows, very faintly, blue-green, like the memory of a light that has no obvious source. If you like, let your shoulders settle. There is nowhere you need to arrive tonight, only somewhere to be. One small thing worth knowing about this particular forest: the moss has been growing here for an extremely long time, and it is, by all accounts, exceptionally soft underfoot. It is possibly aware of this. It has had several centuries to become comfortable with the compliment. Now, relax and enjoy, and let us begin our journey together. Chapter 1. The Weight of the First Step. The first thing Alara noticed was the quiet. Not silence. The forest was not silent. Wind moved high and unhurried through the crowns of the pines, and somewhere deeper in, the thin sound of water finding its way between stones. But all of it sat low, close to the ground, as though the trees had agreed, long before she arrived, that nothing here needed to be loud. She stepped off the path and onto the moss, and her foot sank, not unpleasantly, more as though the ground were making a small accommodation for her weight, offering what it had. The cold came up through the soles of her boots immediately, not sharp, not biting, just present. The way cold in the far north is present, not announcing itself, already woven into everything else. The air in here was not the same air as the path. Out on the path, the air moved. It had somewhere it was going. In here, it was still and dense with the smell of wet bark and pine resin, and something lower than both of those, earthier, darker, the smell of a forest floor that had been a forest floor for a very long time, that had been absorbing rain and fallen needles, and the slow work of roots for longer than anyone who might stand in it could usefully imagine. She breathed it in and paused there for a moment, not moving, simply letting the forest register that she had arrived. Edric was a few paces behind her. She could hear him adjusting the strap of his bag, a sound she'd learned without intending to over many years of walking beside him, the compression of the buckle and the small exhale that followed, which meant he'd found the right position and was satisfied. Then his footsteps joined hers on the moss, softened in the same way hers had been softened, and they were both inside the forest, and the pale afternoon was at their backs. The trees were old. She had known this. They had read about the place, looked at photographs. But photographs did something to old trees that standing near them immediately undid. In photographs, trees were objects. These were not objects. They stood with the quality of stillness that belongs only to things that have been in one place for a very long time and have no intention of ever being anywhere else. The nearest trunk was perhaps 4 times the width of her outstretched arms, its bark furrowed and darkened to something close to charcoal, fissured in long vertical lines that made it look less like bark and more like the surface of something that had been under pressure for centuries and was only very slowly releasing. pale lichen grew in the creases in patterns too irregular to be called patterns, and too deliberate to be called random, ivory-colored, or the color of winter light on old stone, spreading in its unhurried way across the dark. She reached out and touched the bark as she passed. She always did this. She had done it since she was very young, since the first time she had walked beside trees old enough to feel serious, and she had never been able to say why, even to herself. There was no reason, only the need to confirm that the surface was real, that it existed under her fingertips in the way that old bark exists, in a way that nothing else does. This bark was cold and deeply ridged and faintly damp where she pressed her palm flat against it. Her hand came away with a trace of something dark and fine, not quite dirt, not quite anything she had a name for. The light inside the forest was not the same light as outside. Outside, there had still been sky, pale northern winter sky with the late afternoon quality it had up here. A light already in the process of leaving even as it arrived, slightly apologetic about the hour. In here, the light had come down through so many layers of branch and needle, and the slow failing of the afternoon, that by the time it reached the ground, it was barely light at all. More a quality the air had absorbed. She could see clearly. That was not what she meant. What she meant was that the light in here had given up being useful and become something else. Atmosphere, or the visual equivalent of a sound you stop noticing because it has been there long enough to belong. She had stood once in a cathedral in Uppsala while Edric walked the nave slowly. Taking photographs she was almost certain he would never look at again. She had not been thinking about the cathedral. She had been mentally working through a list of things that needed doing the following week, had gotten as far as the second item, and then something had happened, with the quality of light through the high windows, or the specific weight of very old air, and she had simply forgotten what the list was, not completed it, not set it aside, forgotten it cleanly, the way a dream is gone by noon. The forgetting had felt unexpectedly, like something being handed to her. This reminded her of that, though she could not have explained the connection. The moss was extraordinary. She had expected green, and it was green, the way the sea is blue, accurate and wholly insufficient. From standing height, it read as a single surface, one unbroken thing from trunk to trunk. Down close, crouching, it was dozens of separate things layered upon one another. The oldest growth compressed at the base into something pale and dense and almost waxy, and rising from that, fronds in every possible gradation between emerald and grey-green, and the near white of growth that had spent a long time out of direct light. The tallest shoots barely cleared her ankle. They were moving, very slightly, in a current she could not feel on her face, and in the places where the light reached least, in the hollows between the oldest roots, in the lower ground where shadow pooled, the moss carried something else, a glow. Not bright, nothing you could navigate by, more the suggestion of light, a faint blue-green that seemed to come from inside the moss, rather than from any source above it. She looked at it for a long moment. It did not pulse or flicker. It simply was, steadily, without apparent effort, the way the cold was and the quiet was. Edric stopped beside her. He didn't say anything immediately. He had a way of withholding speech when he was paying close attention, as though he were collecting what he was seeing before he decided what, if anything, to do with it. I didn't expect that, he said at last. She glanced at him. He was looking at the same place she was, wearing the expression he had when he was trying to determine whether something was as remarkable as it appeared, or whether he was simply missing context that would make it ordinary. She had seen this expression in front of certain buildings, in front of certain pages of certain books. Now here, in a forest in northern Sweden, in front of moss that glowed without explaining why. Neither did I, she said. It was not a very interesting thing to say, but it was accurate, and accuracy felt like the right register for this place, more right than trying to dress the moment in something it didn't need. They walked further in. The ground descended gradually, and the trees grew closer together, and the cold deepened in the way that cold in deep forest deepens. Not all at once, but in increments you only register when you try to remember how cold it had been at the beginning. Ilara's breath came out in small white shapes that rose a short distance and then disappeared. She watched one go and found herself, for no reason she could name, glad to be the kind of creature whose breath was visible in cold air. There was something honest about it, evidence of something. Edric was walking with his left hand slightly open, fingers relaxed at his side, a thing he did when he was attending carefully to something. She had noticed it years ago and never said anything. You don't name certain habits in people you know well. To name them is to change them, and some things are better left as they are, unspoken, just known. She observed it now the way she observed the cold deepening, and the way the moss underfoot was firmer on the slope, more compressed, as though these lower parts of the forest bore more weight than they seemed to from above. The sound of water was closer, not rushing water, barely water at all, more the sound of water taking its time across stone, considering its route unhurriedly. She could not see it. She was aware of it the way you are aware of something at the very edge of attention. A single pale stem grew sideways from a crack in one of the older trunks, impossibly thin, nearly translucent, the color of birch bark before it has fully whitened. She nearly walked past it. She was glad she hadn't. Wind moved through the high canopy in long, slow waves that took several seconds to cross from one side of the forest to the other. When it passed, the silence it left behind was a different silence than before. Not emptier, but somehow fuller, as though the wave had stirred something into being that settled gently after it moved on. She found herself waiting for the next one without having decided to wait. She touched the bark of a birch as she passed, pale and smooth, peeling at the edges in thin layers like the pages of a very old book, the layer beneath faintly greenish in the low light. Her palm rested there a moment. There was something about all of this, the cold, the glow, the way the forest seemed to have its own interior weather entirely separate from the weather outside, that she made no effort to put into words. She had the strong sense that the words would have been less than the thing itself, and she preferred the thing. Behind her she heard Edric stop as well, not because she had, just because there was no urgency, no reason to be anywhere but where he was. The forest was very quiet around them both. Not silent. There was always the wind, the far-off water, the small sound of something settling in the branches above them, the sound of their own breathing, but quiet the way places are quiet when they have been so for a very long time, when the quiet is not the absence of sound, but something in its own right, layered, specific, with its own texture. The way the moss underfoot was not one thing, but many things at once, each frond a different shade of the same long, unhurried stillness. She stood there. The cold held everything in place. Chapter 2. What the Path Decided. The path, when Ilara noticed it, was not where it should have been. She was almost certain of this. Almost, because certainty in old forests had a way of softening before you could act on it. She had walked this ground coming in, or had walked ground very much like it, and the leaves had been pressed flat in one direction, and the undergrowth unbroken at the edges, the way ground looks when it has not been walked on for some time. Now there was a path, narrow, barely wider than her shoulders, running between two of the oldest pines and curving gently out of sight where the trees grew closest together. The leaves on either side of it were undisturbed, not pressed down, not turned, not moved in any direction she could identify, as though the path had not been walked into existence the way paths usually are, but had simply decided at some point while she was not looking to be there. She stood at its edge and looked at it for a moment. Edric came up beside her and stood looking too. He said nothing. This was one of the things she had always valued about walking with him, the absence of the pressure to narrate. Some people, when they encountered something that required a response, needed to immediately produce the response. Edric held his reaction in his hands a while first, turned it over, checked the weight of it. "The same path," she said, though she already knew the answer. "I don't think so," he said. Neither of them moved toward it immediately. There was no urgency. The path was there, and it would remain there, and the forest was cold and very still, and the glowing moss at the feet of the nearest pine had brightened almost imperceptibly since they'd come in, or hadn't, and she was simply paying closer attention now, which amounted to the same result. She stepped onto it. The ground beneath was firmer than the moss on either side, as though the earth here had been under gentle pressure for a long time. Not human pressure, not footfall, but the slow pressure of roots that had grown and crossed and compressed the soil in their patient subterranean work. The surface was not dirt and not quite moss, something between, fine and dark and faintly springy under her weight, the way ground feels in places that hold water longer than the surrounding terrain. The path curved left and descended, and the trees on either side grew denser, their crowns locking together above, until the strip of sky that had been visible narrowed to a seam and then disappeared. The light changed. What remained was filtered through so many overlapping layers of branch and needle that it had become almost entirely ambient, sourceless, directionless, the same faint grey blue across every surface. She could not have said which direction the sun was, and realized that she had stopped caring some minutes ago, though she could not have named the exact moment. The glow of the moss in this deeper light was no longer subtle, still not bright. She was careful to note this to herself, careful not to overstate it. She had a habit of checking her own perception when something was unusual, a kind of internal calibration. Is this as remarkable as it seems? Or am I simply seeing it that way because I want to? The moss was not incandescent. It did not light the path, but it occupied a narrow band of the blue-green spectrum with a consistency and a steadiness that nothing in an ordinary forest had any reason to occupy. and it grew, she realized, most brightly in the places that were most deeply shadowed, as though it were filling a need the forest had, as though something had arranged it. She didn't say this to Edric. She filed it carefully in the place where she put things she wasn't ready to flatten into language. He had moved to her left and was walking close, but not directly beside her, which was how he walked when he was looking carefully at something, giving himself a slightly different angle, as though distance were its own kind of lens. She could see his breath in the cold air. 2 steps, 3 steps. A brief pause while he looked upward at a crown of branches she followed his gaze to and then released, the way she sometimes followed a thought that turned out to belong to someone else. She thought, for no particular reason, of a weekend she had spent years ago in a house her aunt owned in the archipelago outside Gothenburg. There had been a rowboat tied to the dock, old and in some disrepair, the paint on the hull gone thin and salt-silvered. She had not planned to take it out. She had found herself in it anyway, not rowing anywhere, just sitting in it while it turned slowly in the water, held loosely by its rope. She had done this for perhaps an hour, watching the light on the surface change, and had not thought anything in particular the entire time. It had been, she realized only later, the most genuinely rested she had felt in years. This reminded her of that, which reminded her of nothing, because the path bent again and she was back inside the present moment, which was cold and very quiet, and smelled of pine resin and something else now. Something sweeter, very faint, without a clear origin. Not flowers, warmer than flowers, closer to the smell of old wood that has been somewhere warm for a long time, or the edge of something freshly cut from a living tree. She slowed. The mushroom was beside the path, barely. A single one, not part of a cluster or a ring, entirely alone on a small raised section of moss at the base of a pine, growing sideways from the bark itself, perhaps 30 centimeters from the ground. It was white, the kind of white that has never had anything to do with brightness, not the white of snow or of clouds, but the white of something that simply did not have the information about color that other living things had, and had made something elegant out of the absence. The cap was perhaps the width of her palm. The stalk was thinner than she expected something living to be, thin as paper at the point where it emerged from the bark, and yet clearly, demonstrably there, holding its form with a composure she found, in a way she would not have anticipated, admirable. She crouched down to look at it more closely. The moss around it continued to glow, more concentrated here than elsewhere, as though the mushroom occupied the center of something. The bark behind it was very dark, almost black with moisture, and against that darkness, the white was exact and clean, and completely still. She was close enough to see the tiny frills along the underside of the cap, layered, regular, casting the finest possible shadows on one another in the ambient light. She stayed there for a moment, then she looked up, and the path continued, and Edric was waiting without waiting, standing with his hands at his sides and his face turned slightly upward, watching the mist. She had not noticed the mist until now, which struck her as strange because it was clearly not new. It sat close to the ground, well below knee height, uniformly pale and unhurried, moving in very slow currents. She had to watch for several seconds to detect. The unusual thing, the thing that stopped her when she finally registered it, was the direction, the wind. when it moved at all in here, moved from the east. She had confirmed this by the sound it made in the high canopy, always arriving from the same side, always leaving in the same direction. But the mist, down near the ground, was moving in the opposite direction. Not a little opposite, entirely, steadily, consistently opposite, as though the ground here had its own ideas about circulation. She watched it. The mist did not accelerate or slow. It moved the way it would have moved if the wind had been blowing from the west, which it was not, and offered no further explanation. Edric glanced at her. She glanced at him. Neither of them said anything, which was the right thing to do. The path widened slightly as it leveled out, and the moss on either side grew deeper, closer to the ground, denser, the older layers so compressed they had lost their individual fronds entirely and become something almost like felt, dark and solid, and faintly iridescent where the glow reached them. The light was barely light anymore. She did not feel the darkness as a lack. It was more that the scale of everything had shifted slightly. The way rooms feel larger when you're in them alone at night. Not ominous, but expanded. The proportions having become honest. She had started walking more slowly than she was aware of. She registered this when she noticed that Edric, who generally matched her pace without effort, had also slowed. They were moving through the forest at the speed the forest seemed to prefer, unhurried, without destination, following the path because it was there, and because the alternative was to stop entirely, which would also have been fine. Above them, in the canopy, something moved that was not wind. She caught it at the very edge of her vision, to the right and above, where two branches crossed. Something had been still, and then wasn't, or had been absent, and then briefly present. She could not have said which. By the time she turned her head to look directly, there was nothing but branch and shadow, and the usual construction of an old pine seen from below. She looked a moment longer, in a way that felt less like searching, and more like simply keeping the possibility open. She did not look at Edric to see if he had noticed. She had the sense that whatever she might see here would only reveal itself to indirect attention, and she wanted to keep practicing that skill. The path continued. The cold continued. The mist moved along the ground in its quiet, wind-defying way, and the moss glowed steadily at the roots of the old trees, and the smell of sweet warm wood came and went without ever fully arriving. Edric reached forward and just barely nudged her elbow with the back of his hand. Not to say anything, not to point at anything specific, just the small contact, brief and unannounced, that said, "I am here too. I am seeing this too. This is remarkable, and I am glad we are here for it." She felt unexpectedly a warmth that had nothing to do with the temperature. The path curved ahead, into the part of the forest where the trees grew so closely together that they seemed to become, from a distance, a single darkness with many trunks. A single breathing thing. The moss along the roots down there was brighter than anything she had seen so far. Not dramatically so, but enough that the difference was beyond question. As though the deeper you went, the longer the forest had been glowing. She adjusted the collar of her coat against the cold, and they walked on. Chapter 3. 30 Shades of One Color. The clearing was not large. It had no particular reason to exist in the middle of a forest this dense. No fallen tree to explain it, no rock formation that had crowded the pines back. It was simply a place where the trees had, at some point in the long work of their growing, chosen to leave space between themselves, a roughly oval opening in the canopy, perhaps 10 meters across at its widest, enough to see sky, though the sky was now the color of pewter and gave little back. The ground inside the clearing was entirely moss, no roots breaking the surface, no protruding stone, nothing but the continuous soft spread of it, deeper here than anywhere Ilara had seen along the path, reaching above her ankles at the center. She stood at the edge and looked at it for a moment. Then she walked in. The moss received her differently here, more fully, each step settling with a give that was unhurried. A slow return of pressure, the way water moves back into a depression after your hand has passed through it. She made her way to a low shelf of stone that emerged from the far side of the clearing, half submerged in growth, and sat down. The stone was cold through her coat. Then it was less cold. Then it was simply there, a surface to be in contact with, neither comfortable nor uncomfortable, one of the many facts of the place. Edric found a pine at the clearing's edge, its trunk angled very slightly, and leaned his back against it with the ease of someone who had been looking for precisely this configuration. He let his bag slide from his shoulder and settle into the moss beside him. And then he was still, and they were both still, and the clearing was still around them. She looked down at the moss between her boots. Up close, properly close, elbows on knees, face perhaps 40 centimeters from the ground. It was not green, or it was green, in the same technical sense that a cathedral window was simply colored glass, accurate and missing everything. She had been looking at moss her entire life. It grew on the stones around her parents' house, on the walls of older buildings she'd passed thousands of times, on the north faces of trees in parks and on country walks. And she had always thought of it as green, the way she thought of bark as brown, and sky as blue, the way she thought of things that didn't require more precision than that. She saw now that she had been maintaining a very convenient fiction. The surface in front of her was layered in a way that took several seconds to fully register. The oldest growth at the base was pale, nearly colorless, compressed into something dense and mat-like that had passed beyond the category of plant and become closer to mineral, ancient, structural, the foundation on which everything else rested. Above that, a middle layer of growth that still held its form, individual fronds distinguishable, the color of deep shadow under a canopy of leaves, a green so dark it was nearly gray, nearly the color of still water, and above that, the newest growth, the tips of each frond, fine as breath, reaching with a looseness that made them seem perpetually in very slight motion, even when the air was perfectly still. These were the color she had no name for. Not emerald, not jade. Something between those and the blue-green of the glow that came from the oldest roots, as though the moss at its tips was practicing becoming luminescent, as though it was working toward that. She tried to hold all of it in one look and found she could not. Each layer demanded its own attention, and attention given to one was attention taken from the others, and by the time she returned to the first layer, it had shifted. Not changed, but shifted in the way a piece of music shifts between hearings, showing you something it had always contained that you had not been listening for. The color of it, she thought, was not a thing you could describe to someone who had not seen it. You would say green, and they would picture green, and they would be wrong in a way neither of you could correct for. Which was, she supposed, fine. Some things were not for describing. Some things were for standing near. The glow from the oldest roots, here in the clearing where the trees stood back, was easier to see than it had been on the path. Not stronger, she didn't think it was stronger, but the ambient light had dimmed enough that the contrast was clearer. The way stars become visible, not because they grow brighter, but because everything else has darkened around them. She watched it for a while. It did not pulse. It did not vary. It simply persisted, with the quality of something that had been persisting for an extremely long time and had no particular opinion about whether it was observed. There was something almost companionable about this, something she noticed without quite knowing how to finish the observation. The glow was there, she was there, and neither of them was making any demands on the other. She had read years ago, in a book she could no longer name, that certain species of moss were among the oldest continuously living organisms on the surface of the earth, that a single colony of moss could persist for hundreds, even thousands of years, the individual plants dying and being replaced at the tips while the base remained, technically the same organism that had begun, so that to stand beside very old moss was to stand beside something that had been alive in an unbroken line, through centuries of winters that it had simply absorbed and continued. She had not thought about this fact since reading it. She thought about it now, and then the thought shifted sideways and became something else, the way thoughts do in very quiet places, and then it was gone, and she was simply back to looking at the color. From the edge of the clearing, Edric let out a long breath. Not a sigh. There was nothing effortful in it, nothing of the kind of breath you release when you have been holding something, more the breath that comes when a body settles fully into stillness and discovers it was slightly less still than it thought, and corrects. His shoulders, she could see from where she sat, dropped a fraction. His head tilted very slightly back against the bark. She watched this and said nothing. There was nothing to say, and nothing would have been an intrusion. The clearing was doing something to them both, she thought, doing it quietly, without announcement, the way places with their own deep internal weather do things to people who sit inside them long enough, not changing them, only inviting a particular configuration. The body, in a place this still, finds that its ordinary busyness has no audience and begins tentatively to let it go. She stretched one hand out and pressed it flat into the moss beside her. The cold came through her palm at once, and the moisture, and the fine-grained texture of the fronds bending under her weight, soft in a way that was different from fabric, different from anything manufactured, because there was life in it, not warmth. The moss was cold, but the cold was alive. Whatever distinction existed between cold and living had been worked out a long time ago in this particular piece of ground, and the answer, apparently, was that the two were not in opposition. She kept her hand there. The stillness in the clearing had its own interior. She was only beginning to understand this. From outside, in the early minutes, she had perceived it as uniform. The forest was quiet, the clearing was quiet. The cold and the grey light and the slow mist were all part of the same continuous absence of disturbance. But sitting here, hand in the moss, nothing to do and nowhere to be, she found that the quiet was not one thing at all. It was layered in the same way the moss was layered, different qualities at different depths, each one requiring its own kind of attention to become audible. There was the surface quiet, wind, high and distant, the occasional small sound of the canopy shifting. This was what she had heard on the path, what she would have described if someone had asked her what the forest sounded like. Below that was a middle quiet she had only recently begun to hear, the specific absence of human sound, which was itself a sound, in the way that the specific absence of movement in old rooms is itself a kind of presence. And below that was something else, something she had no word for. Not silence, the way stone is silent, or deep water, or the interior of something very old. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of something that had no need of it. She was aware of her own breathing. She became aware, having become aware of her own breathing, of Edric's breathing as well. A few meters away, slower and more even than hers, with the particular rhythm of someone who is simply present. 2 breaths in a clearing in a forest in the north of Sweden, steam rising briefly in the cold air, and then gone, and the moss indifferent and glowing and continuing. She had come into this forest looking for something she could not have named on the way in, and she had not found it, and she had found something else instead, something that required the not finding as a precondition. She considered this, the thought moving outward, and then the wind shifted high above them, and the clearing breathed, and the thought came home. She was here. That was already the thing she had been looking for. It had been here before she arrived. A sound came from somewhere near the far edge of the clearing. Very small. Not a footstep. Not a branch. The sound of something light and careful, setting its weight down on the moss, and then lifting it again. Barely audible. Less a sound than the idea of one. Present just long enough to be real and gone before it resolved into any recognizable shape. She did not turn toward it immediately. She kept her hand in the moss and let her eyes move, slowly, to the tree line. Nothing she could see directly. Nothing that would stay still long enough to become a shape. Only the trees and the moss, and between them in the low grey light, the possibility of something that had been near enough to hear and was now deciding at its own pace what to do next. She remained exactly as she was, hand in the moss, back straight, breath slow. The possibility remained as well. Edric did not move. She did not look at him to confirm this. She could feel it in the quality of the clearing's stillness, the way the space between them had held its shape. He had heard it too, she was almost certain. He had heard it and made the same quiet decision she had made. To remain, to attend without pressure, to let whatever was near be near, in whatever way it chose to be near. The cold settled around her like water around a stone. The moss under her hand was wet and alive and old and still. Somewhere in the highest branches, the wind passed through, and the forest made the sound it made when wind passed through it, a long collective breath in a language she had no words for, and the sound moved across the clearing from one side to the other, and then was gone, and the silence it left in its wake was fuller than the silence before, as though the wave had stirred something loose that was now settling, gently, back toward the ground. She did not need anything to happen. This was what the clearing was teaching her, without any pedagogical intention, without knowing she was there to be taught. She did not need anything to happen. The moss would continue to glow. The mist would continue its quiet contrarian movement along the ground. The things at the edge of sight would continue their careful, unexplained presence, and she would continue to sit here with her hand in the cold moss and Edric's breathing at her back. That was already everything. Chapter 4. The Creatures in the Corner of Seeing. She found them first by accident. Her eyes had been on the moss, following the precise point where the glow was strongest at the base of the nearest root. She had been trying to determine whether the light was brighter at the very surface, or whether it came from somewhere beneath the surface, some layer of growth compressed deep enough that the glow accumulated there and rose. And while she was engaged in this, entirely absorbed, something moved. Not in front of her. To the left, in the space between two pines at the edge of the clearing, perhaps 3 meters off the ground, a displacement in the light, not a flash, nothing dramatic, only the sense that the air in that particular location had rearranged itself in a way that air did not usually rearrange itself. She looked up. Nothing. Trees, shadow, the usual architecture of an old forest seen at dusk-adjacent light, the moss at the roots still glowing, nothing between the trunks that would account for what she had noticed, no explanation for the particular quality of absence that now occupied the space where something had briefly been. She returned her eyes to the moss, and in the very moment she did, in the precise moment her attention moved away and settled back onto the glow at the root, it happened again. This time she did not look up. She held very still instead and let her eyes remain where they were, on the moss, on the root, on the blue-green light persisting in its quiet way while expanding what she was attending to. Not looking, attending. The distinction mattered here. She felt this without being able to articulate why. Looking was directed, purposeful, a narrowing. What this required was the opposite, a widening, a letting go of the focal point, allowing everything in her peripheral field to become equally present. The way you listen in the dark, not for any particular sound, just listening. She sat very still. At the edge of her vision, something was there. Not a shape, or not a shape she could hold, more a coherence of light that didn't belong to the trees, that moved with a quality distinct from the way the mist moved, from the way shadows moved when wind came through the canopy. It was warm-toned in a place that was uniformly cool. It was slightly brighter than its surroundings, in a way that had nothing to do with any source she could identify. It moved, very slowly, in an arc that curved away from the tree line and back again, and it moved with the quality, this was the only way she could put it to herself, of something that was aware of being somewhere. She breathed very carefully. The light continued its arc. She did not turn her head. She sat with a slight physical discomfort of holding her gaze in one direction while attending to another. The mild strain of eyes asked to maintain a position they had not chosen, and she found that the discomfort was manageable, even useful in a strange way. It gave her something to do, a small physical task to occupy the part of her that would otherwise have tried to analyze, to name, to reach for the thing before the thing was ready to be reached for. Edric, when she became aware of him again, had moved. Quietly, without calling attention to it, he had come from the tree at the clearing's edge and was now sitting on the moss near the base of the stone shelf where she had been. Not beside her exactly, slightly below and to her right, his back against the low rock, legs extended in front of him and crossed at the ankle. She had not heard him cross the clearing. She was not certain when he had moved. He was simply here now, in a different position than before, as though he had always been here, and the other position were the variation. He was looking straight ahead. She could see his profile, the slight angle of his jaw, the way his breath came and went in small white shapes that dissolved almost before they had formed, the characteristic stillness of his face when he was paying the kind of attention that didn't require expression. She did not ask if he had seen anything. She already knew that he had. The smell arrived without announcement. She noticed it first as something wrong, not unpleasant, but misplaced. Sweet, very faintly, in a way she had not anticipated and could not immediately locate. She moved her attention over the possible sources. Pine resin, which she knew well, which had been here all along, which was sharp and clear and nothing like this. Moss, which was wet and cold and earthen, and not this. The bark of the older trees, which had the dark mineral smell of wet stone. Closer, but still not this. This was warm. That was the distinguishing fact. Everything else in the clearing had the temperature of still air and old growth and deep winter. But this smell was warm, not aggressively warm, not the warmth of something burning, but the warmth of dry wood that has been sitting near a source of heat for a long time and has absorbed it so thoroughly that the warmth is now interior, structural, like the inside of a wooden box that has been left near a hearth, like the grain of old floorboards in a house where people have lived for a long time. She had never encountered it in a forest before. It came in small increments, present, then not, then present again, and each time it appeared she became more certain it had no origin she could point to, not a plant, not the earth, not the trees, something else, something that moved, perhaps, and left the warmth of itself briefly in the air as it passed. She thought about the thing at the edge of her vision. She did not pursue the connection further than that. There were more of them now. She was almost sure of this. The peripheral field had filled in some way that she could not account for in terms of ordinary forest activity. The number of these small coherences of warm light, these arcs of purposeful movement just outside the range of direct sight, had increased in the time since she'd first noticed them, or she had become sufficiently skilled at the not looking to perceive what had been there all along. She could not count them. To count required a kind of focused attention that would have undone the ability to see them at all. She had the impression, nothing more precise than an impression, of several, of an unhurried gathering. Nothing crowded, nothing sudden, only the sense that the clearing was occupied in a way it had not been when they'd first arrived, and that this occupation had occurred in the patient, deliberate way that was consistent with everything else in this forest, without announcement, without haste, simply as a natural development of the conditions being right. Edric's shoulder, very lightly, came to rest against her knee. He had shifted, slightly, without making a production of it, and now one shoulder was just touching the fabric of her coat, a contact so minimal it was barely contact at all, and yet entirely unmistakable in what it said. He was not drawing her attention anywhere, not pointing, not questioning, only arriving at an arrangement that placed them in proximity for the ordinary reason that proximity, in a place like this, was preferable to its alternative. She felt the warmth of it through the wool. She did not move. The lights at the edge of her vision continued their slow, unhurried circling. Time had become, in the clearing, a different kind of thing. She was aware of this without being troubled by it. It was more an observation than a problem. Time in ordinary circumstances moved with a reference point. There was where you had been, and there was where you were, and the distance between them was measurable in minutes or in the progress of the light. In the clearing, these reference points had become unreliable. The light was not changing in any way she could use. She had no hunger, no stiffness, no particular signal from her body that a calculable interval had passed. There was only the moss and the cold and the quiet and the warmth at her shoulder and the patient presences at the edge of seeing. She found she did not mind this. There was, in fact, something close to relief in it. She had spent most of her adult life in relationships with time that were, at best, uneasy. Time was something to be tracked, managed, accounted for, something with opinions about how she spent it, something she owed things to. Here, time had no opinions. Or if it had opinions, they were the opinions of something very old that had long since lost the urgency to impose them. Here time grew the way moss grew, so slowly that growth and stillness were the same thing, and neither one was owed to anything except itself. One of the lights came closer. She knew this the way you know, in a room, when someone has moved nearer to you without looking at them. A shift in the quality of the air, something the peripheral field registers as a change in the geometry of things. It did not come close enough to become a shape. It remained in the undeclared territory of the almost seen, the not quite there, the present only when unlooked at. But it was closer than before. She could feel the difference. Not with her eyes. Something else. Some attention that was lower and older than vision, that didn't require light to function. The warm, woody smell was back, clearer now, nearby. She thought suddenly, and with no preamble, of sitting on a back step as a child. Her grandmother's house, late summer, the door to the kitchen open behind her, and the smell of something baking coming through it. She had not thought of this in years. The thought arrived complete, with its particular quality of warmth and enclosure, and sat with her for a moment, and then dissolved back into the clearing, and she was here, on cold stone, in a Swedish forest, with warm light moving just at the limit of her perception. The thought had been a gift. She did not try to hold it. Edric exhaled slowly, long and even, the kind of breath that belongs to a body that has spent long enough in one place to let something go. She listened to it, and then she let her own breath follow, not intentional, not a decision, simply the ease of two people in the same still air who had forgotten, separately and at nearly the same time, that there had ever been anything to brace against. The lights moved. The clearing held them. The moss continued its ancient, indifferent illumination, not for them, not despite them, only for its own reasons, which had nothing to do with being watched, and everything to do with the cold and the dark, and the long, slow work of being what it was. She rested her hand on Edric's shoulder, briefly. Then she returned it to her own lap. He didn't turn. Neither did she. Above them, Without warning or particular emphasis, one of the creatures, if that was what they were, if the word applied at all, passed directly overhead, not through the canopy, through the air of the clearing itself, perhaps 6 meters above the moss, in a smooth, unhurried arc that went from one edge to the other in what felt like no time at all. She saw it entirely in peripheral vision, a warmth and a coherence and a suggestion of light moving through the grey in the way that certain things move when they are entirely certain of where they are going and entirely unbothered about arriving. Then it was past the tree line, and the clearing was as it had been. Ilara sat with it. The cold was right here. The moss was right here. The warm smell had not yet entirely faded. She did not move for a long time after. Chapter 5. The sound the forest makes when it breathes. At some point, she had stopped watching for movement. She noticed this only because she noticed its absence. The particular absence of the specific alertness she had been maintaining since the first light had appeared at the edge of the clearing. That alertness had been present without her having decided to adopt it. A quality of readiness, of peripheral attention held gently in place, the inner equivalent of keeping a door slightly open. She could not have said when it had let itself go, only that it had. Only that she was sitting here now on the cold stone with her hands in her lap and the glow of the moss in the ground before her, and she was not watching for anything at all. She was simply here. This was different from the watching, easier and harder in ways she could not entirely separate. Easier because it asked nothing of her. Harder because everything she was used to doing with her attention, sorting, tracking, maintaining the running low-level account of where things were and what they might do next, had no purchase here, and the part of her that ran on that mechanism was only now beginning to understand that it had been given the evening off. Edric had not moved from his position near the stone shelf. She could hear his breathing, slow, untroubled, with the evenness of someone who had arrived at genuine stillness rather than performed it. The two of them had been quiet together for a long time, long enough that the quality of the quiet had changed several times, the way it does in the company of someone you are comfortable with. First, the quiet of two people who have chosen not to speak. Then the quiet of two people who have forgotten that speech was an option. She began to listen, not for anything specific, only to hear what was there when you stopped expecting something from it, when you approached the forest sound the way she had learned, in the last hour, to approach its light. Not searching, not directed, simply open. The wind, she found, was not one thing. There were at least 3 winds. The highest was barely audible, a continuous, thin, breath-like movement through the topmost crowns, the needles there so fine and numerous that the sound they made was more white than tonal, a consistent hiss that sat above the other sounds, the way a fine layer of snow sits above the ground. It covers, present everywhere, obscuring nothing. Below that, a second wind moved through the middle canopy at irregular intervals, longer pauses, then a swell that gathered itself over several seconds and passed through the branches in a slow exhalation, the individual needles and the smaller boughs producing a sound that was lower, rounder, more varied, and at the lowest level, moving occasionally through the ground growth and the remaining outer fronds of the deepest moss, something that was barely wind at all, a slow, almost imperceptible current that she felt more on her face than heard. The particular chill of air that has travelled a long way close to the ground. 3 winds, moving independently, occasionally coinciding. When they coincided, the sound of the forest was briefly something else. A chord, almost, the way unrelated notes can accidentally resolve into something you'd be willing to call music if you were in the right frame of mind. She was in the right frame of mind. Below the wind, there was the water. She had been aware of it since the path. The thin, unhurried sound of it finding its way across stone, somewhere in the deeper forest. A sound too intermittent to locate, too persistent to forget. Now, in the stillness of the clearing, she could hear it more clearly, and she understood something about it she had not understood before. It was not one stream, or if it was one stream, it was a stream that moved across several different kinds of stone, each producing a distinct register, a high, thin note where the water crossed something smooth and shallow, a lower sound where it gathered briefly before moving on, and at intervals, a sound that was almost no sound at all. The sound of water falling a very short distance into something and being absorbed. She followed this auditorially, the way you follow a thread with your fingers in the dark, not able to see where it goes, only able to feel the direction of the next few centimeters. The stream, or the collection of sounds she was calling a stream, moved from right to left, across the range of her hearing. It was not getting closer. She was not interested in it getting closer. She was interested only in the fact of it, in the way it occupied the lower register, the way it provided a kind of floor beneath the sounds of the wind, a reference point that made the other sounds more legible. Her breathing had slowed without her having attended to it. She noticed this and left it alone. Edric shifted slightly, not standing, only adjusting, the small reconfiguration a body makes when it has been in one position long enough and discovers it would prefer another. She heard the compression of moss under his weight, the faint sound of his coat moving against the stone, a breath he released as he settled. Then he was still again, but differently still, a stillness with a slightly different center of gravity, a few degrees of change in the angle of his shoulders. Beside him, a small branch, growing low from the nearest pine, barely above shoulder height, swayed once. He had caught it in the adjustment without noticing. She watched it oscillate, once, twice, a third time with less amplitude, a fourth time barely at all, a fifth time not quite returning to where it had started, and then going still. The entire sequence took perhaps 4 seconds. He didn't notice it had moved. She watched it anyway, saw the last of its motion resolve into stillness, and felt, for no reason that was proportionate to the event, something uncomplicated and warm settle in her chest. She glanced at him. He was looking at the moss ahead. She returned to looking at the moss ahead. The silence between sounds. This was the thing she had not expected. That the most interesting sound in the clearing was the sound of what happened between the other sounds. When the upper wind paused, when the water found a moment of even flow that produced nothing distinctive, when Edric had stilled and her own breathing had slowed to something she was no longer monitoring. The silence in those intervals was not empty. It had a specific texture, a specific weight, the weight of something that had been accumulating for a very long time in a place that had not been disturbed very much. She thought briefly of concert halls. the specific quality of a concert hall in the seconds after the last note has been played and before the audience begins to move. That same heldness, that same sense of something that had been temporarily displaced, now returning to where it was kept. The sound of a room remembering what it was. This forest, she thought, was always in that state. The music had played here long before any audience had arrived, and it would continue long after. The silence between its notes was not absence, but residence, the thing that lived here the way the moss lived here, without explanation, without apology, simply occupying the ground because the ground was available and the conditions were right. The warm, woody smell had returned, faint and from no direction she could name, and present in the way it had been present before, arriving and departing in its own time, consulting nothing and no one. She breathed it in when it came and did not pursue it when it went. There was a rhythm to it, she was beginning to think. Not a regular rhythm, nothing you could anticipate, but a rhythm in the sense that its returns were not random. They followed something, some logic of movement or proximity, or the particular way the three winds were aligning at a given moment. She could not read the logic. She was comfortable not reading it. The lights at the edge of her vision had quieted, or she had, and from the inside the effect was the same. She was no longer attending to them the way she had attended to them in the early part of the evening. They were simply part of the clearing now, part of the same ambient fact as the glow of the moss and the movement of the mist and the three-layered sound of the wind. Familiar, belonging here, as she was learning to belong here, in the temporary way of things that had been accepted without ceremony. One of her boots had gone slightly numb from the cold. She registered this as information rather than complaint. The mist had reached the center of the clearing. She had not watched it come. It had moved in the way it moved, too slow to track, only legible in comparison to where it had been before. Now it covered the moss almost completely, sitting so close to the surface that the glow came up through it, rather than reflecting off it, making the ground appear to be lit from inside, which, in a way she was no longer surprised by, it was. The mist diffused the light and softened it, and gave it a new quality, more lunar than bioluminescent, less specific and more pervasive. The clearing was different for it, not darker, only more complete. Edric made a small sound. Not a word. Less than a word. The kind of sound a person makes when they have perceived something, and the response is too fundamental for language. She understood it perfectly. She had made the same sound internally, watching the mist absorb the light and give it back changed. The cold had deepened in the time they had been sitting. She could feel it at her cheeks now, the particular cold of exposed skin in still winter air. Not unpleasant, more like a border, a precise demarcation of the edge of her face. "This is where you end," the cold said. "This is where the clearing begins." She found the clarity of the distinction useful, in a way she could not have anticipated. There was something settling about, knowing exactly where you ended. Her shoulders had dropped at some point, while she was not attending to them. She noticed this the way she had noticed the slowing of her breathing. After the fact, with a mild, uncritical interest. Her body had been making its own decisions, very sensible ones, while her attention was elsewhere. She had no objection to any of them. The wind moved through the canopy in one of its long, slow waves. She tracked it from the moment it entered the trees at the north edge of the clearing, listened to it gather itself as it crossed the upper crowns, felt the faint air movement of its lowest layer brush the moss at the clearing's edge, heard it recede into the trees on the southern side, and diminish, and diminish, and become the high continuous hiss of the topmost needles, and then settle back into the between-sound silence it had briefly interrupted. The clearing breathed. She had thought this before, or something like it, and she thought it again now with no particular sense of repetition, only the mild recognition of a thing returning at the right moment. The forest breathed. Not metaphorically, not in the sense of an appealing comparison she was choosing to make. In some literal and unhurried way, it did, and she was breathing with it. She had been for some time now, without having arranged it. Her chest moved when the upper wind moved. Her exhale came when the wave passed. She was not performing this synchrony. She had not chosen it. It had arrived the way the slowing of her breath had arrived, quietly, and from somewhere she had not been watching. She sat with it for a long time, and the clearing held her, and the moss glowed beneath the mist, and Edric was beside her, and the creatures were wherever they were, which was near enough. There was nowhere else she was aware of needing to be. This was, she understood, already quite different from knowing there was nowhere else she needed to be. The distinction mattered. She let it stay. Chapter 6. Stone Memory. The stone had been cold for a long time before she arrived, and it would be cold for a long time after she left. She was aware of this in the way you become aware of things in very still places, not as a thought exactly, more as a fact that had been present all along and only now found the conditions to be noticed. The stone did not make itself cold. It simply was cold, in the same way it simply was stone, and she was simply leaning against it, and the cold was moving through her coat with the patience of something that had never needed to hurry. She noticed the cold at her lower back first, then between her shoulder blades, then across the widest part of her upper back, where the fabric pressed flattest against the surface. It was not unpleasant. She registered this with mild interest. She had expected unpleasant, or had expected to have an opinion about the cold, but the opinion had not materialized. The cold was there, and it was significant in the way that temperature is always significant when you attend to it, but it was not demanding anything from her. It moved into her, and she let it, and at some point, she could not have said exactly when, the distinction between where the cold ended and where she began became less important than she'd assumed it would be. Her eyes were still open. She was still looking at the clearing. The mist had covered everything below her knees. She realized she had been watching it for some time without having registered that she was watching it. It had entered her field of attention the way the sounds had entered it, without invitation, simply by being present long enough to become familiar. The moss was entirely submerged. She could see the glow of it through the mist, diffused and even, a blue-green luminescence that no longer had a specific source. The whole floor of the clearing was emitting something. She noticed this and let it be what it was. The cold moved deeper. She was aware of it now at her sides, where the coat fit less closely. The air finding its way in through the gaps, the way cold air always finds its way in, not with any particular intention, but with the persistent interest of something following a gradient. She noticed this with the same mild, uncritical attention she had been applying to everything for the last. How long? She genuinely did not know. She had no anxiety about not knowing. Edric was still beside her. She could feel the warmth of him at her right side, a few centimeters away, not touching, but near enough that the cold on her right was measurably less than the cold on her left. And this difference was itself a kind of information, a kind of map of where he was relative to where she was. She found this, in a way she could not have anticipated, reassuring, not because she had been worried about where he was, only because it was good to know that warmth was where it was, that it had not moved. She noticed her hands. They were in her lap, palms upward, which was not how she usually held them. She had not arranged them this way deliberately. They had arrived here on their own, and she observed this with the same mild interest with which she had been observing everything. Palms upward, fingers slightly curled. The cold on her palms was more specific than the cold at her back, more intimate, because her palms were the most attentive part of her, the part most accustomed to expecting information. The cold there was specific in a way. The cold at her back was not. She could feel the exact center of each palm, the lines of the fingers, the slight difference in temperature between the webbed skin at the base of her fingers and the flatter skin of the palm itself. She turned her right hand over and pressed it into the moss beside her. The cold was immediate, and the wetness was immediate, and the texture of the fronds. She had touched moss before in this clearing, but not quite from this angle, not quite with this quality of attention, and she noticed that it was different from what she remembered. Finer, more individuated, each frond distinctly itself beneath her palm, the cool and the wet, and the specific aliveness of it, the quality of contact that only living things have, the quality that is not softness exactly, but the response of something that is not rigid, something that has give, because it is, on its most fundamental level, still in the process of doing something. Her hand settled. She stopped noticing the cold on her palm as a cold thing and started noticing it as a thing that was simply there, a condition, not a problem, like the stone at her back, like the air at her face. She was aware of these points of contact, back, palm, face, and the warmth of Edric's proximity at her side. 4 things, all of them sufficient, all of them asking nothing of her. Her shoulders were heavy. She noticed this the way she had noticed her hands, after the fact, with the mild surprise of finding that something had changed while she was attending elsewhere. Heavy was the right word. Not tired. She was not tired in the way that signaled anything needed doing. Heavy, in the way that meant settled. In the way that a book feels heavy when you have been holding it for a long time and finally set it down, and your arm remembers, briefly, what it had been doing, and then releases the memory. Her shoulders had set the memory down. They were not braced. They were not held. They were simply resting in the position that the cold and the stone and the still air had gradually composed for them. She let them rest. The clearing was doing the same thing to Edric that it was doing to her, but from the outside, it looked different. She was aware of this because she turned once, very slightly, not to look at him directly, only a fractional rotation of her attention. And she could see in the line of his neck and the set of his jaw the same quality of surrender that she felt internally. He was not asleep. His eyes were open, directed at the middle distance, at the mist-covered moss, and the glow that came through it. He was simply somewhere that was not quite ordinary wakefulness, and not quite anywhere else. The in-between place, the place the clearing had been constructing for them, patiently, since they'd arrived. She realized she had been in it for some time already. The cold at her back had stopped being cold and become warmth. Not actual warmth, not a change in temperature she could have measured. The stone had not warmed. She had simply reached the point she understood, at which the two temperatures had agreed on a shared value, and there was no longer any differential to be felt. She was cold in the way that the stone was cold, entirely, without qualification, and without it meaning anything that required a response. The stone had been holding this cold for a long time, long before she arrived, long before anyone arrived. It had been here in this configuration, this particular stone, this particular clearing, this particular quality of still winter air. Through seasons she had no way of accounting for. Ice and thaw, the forest growing up around it, the moss accumulating its long, slow glow at its base. She was one afternoon among however many this stone had absorbed, each one indistinguishable from the last, each one received with the same patience. She found this thought unexpectedly comfortable, not because it diminished her, only because it put her weight into perspective, which turned out to be a different thing entirely. The sounds of the clearing continued. The three winds, each in its own layer, the water in the deep forest following its stone, the near silence between them. She was not tracking these anymore. They had passed into the background, the way familiar sounds pass, becoming part of the room rather than features of it. She knew they were there the way she knew the stone was there, by the evidence of contact, not by active attention. Her breathing had become long. She noticed this in the way she had been noticing everything. After the fact, with mild interest, no corrective impulse. Each breath was longer than she would have measured as normal, slower at both ends. The inhale taking its time to arrive, reaching its limit softly. The exhale releasing without effort, each one slightly longer than the one before, in a way that was not effortful or deliberate. Only what happened when a body in a still place, with no particular agenda, allowed its own pace to emerge. Her palm in the moss was no longer a palm in moss. It was simply a warmth in a cold thing, or a cold thing touching a living thing, or two temperatures at a boundary, which was. She followed the thought as it moved outward and curved gently back. Only another way of describing contact. Two things in contact. The contact was the fact. Everything else was what you called it, depending on which side of it you were on. Edric's breath came out long and visible in the cold air. She watched it rise and thin and disappear. Her own breath followed it a few seconds later and thinned and disappeared in the same way. The moss glowed through the mist without interruption. The creatures, wherever they were near. The stone held her and was held by nothing and continued. Chapter 7. When hands stop needing to hold. Her palm was still in the moss. She had forgotten it was there, and then remembered, and then forgotten again, and the forgetting had happened faster the second time. That was how it worked in this clearing. The intervals between forgetting and remembering had been shortening all evening. the way the intervals between something you say and the echo of it shorten as the walls come closer, until eventually the wall is right here, and the echo and the saying are the same thing. Her hand in the moss, cold and wet and alive under her palm. She attended to it now with the kind of attention that was not quite attention anymore, less a directing toward than a registering of what was already present. The fronds were there, the cold was there, the specific give of living material beneath her fingers was there, the way it had been there since she placed her hand down, except that she was now aware of it differently. Not more acutely, only more simply. The distinction between her hand and the moss had become, in some practical way, less interesting. She turned her hand over, palm upward now, facing the grey sky she could not see through the canopy. The cold came to this side differently, less intimate, more general, the open air rather than the specific cold of a living surface. She let both versions stay in her awareness at once. The cold from below, which was the cold of the stone against her legs, and the cold from above, which was the cold of winter air resting on the inside of her wrist. Two temperatures arriving from two directions. She was the thing between them. This was accurate. She was the thing between them, and she was cold from both sides, and this did not require anything from her. Not management, not resolution, not the selection of one over the other. Both could be there. Both were there. She was between them, and they were not in conflict. The moss glowed underneath the mist at the level of her knees. She had stopped finding this extraordinary. She was aware that it was still remarkable in some absolute sense, that if she described it to someone tomorrow in an ordinary room in ordinary light, they would have found it remarkable. But from inside the clearing, it had passed into the category of things that were simply true about this place. The cold was true. The three winds were true. The glow of the moss through the low-lying mist was true. She had been here long enough that the strangeness had metabolized. Edric had not moved in a long time. She was aware of this through the quality of his stillness more than through any act of looking. She had not looked at him directly for, she could not say how long. His breathing was still audible, very slow, with the evenness that belonged to genuine rest. She did not need to confirm this by looking. She knew his breathing the way she knew the sound of the water in the deep forest, the way she knew the upper wind, not by attending to it specifically, but by its continuous, low-level presence in the texture of everything. His shoulder was near her shoulder, not touching. The warmth between them was a warmth she was no longer tracking, only benefiting from. The way you benefit from a window when the sun is on the right side, without particularly thinking about the window. She placed her hand back into the moss, palm down again. The cold was immediate again, and the wet, and the fine-grained resistance of the fronds. She pressed down slightly, not forcefully, only with the weight of her hand, the unintentional downward tendency of a thing that has stopped holding itself up. The glow from this angle, hand down, face tilted slightly forward, was directly beneath her, not beside her, not ahead of her, beneath. The mist that covered the moss was thin enough that the light came through it without significant diffusion at this proximity, and she could see, or nearly see, the specific fronds that were glowing, the oldest growth, compressed at the base of the nearest root, a dense and ancient layer, that had been accumulating this quiet light for longer than she could meaningfully hold in her mind. She did not try to hold it. The light was simply there, at the level of her hand, coming from a direction that was below her and very close. She could feel it almost. Not warmth. It had no warmth, but a presence. The way you feel the presence of something near without touching it. Or perhaps she was feeling the cold of the ground coming up through the few centimeters of mist and calling it presence, because that was what the evening had made her inclined to call things. Either way, her fingers had spread slightly in the moss without her having instructed them to. She noticed this, the last time for some while that she would use even this approximation of noticing, and left them as they were. 5 fingers spread in living moss, cold on the back of the hand and cold at the fingertips, and the slight moisture wicking up through the skin at the points of deepest contact. She could feel each point of contact separately if she chose to attend to them separately, or all at once if she did not. And she found herself moving between these modes in a rhythm that was not quite a rhythm, more a drifting, attending to the middle finger, the cold there, then releasing it back into the general fact of her hand, then attending briefly to the thumb, its contact slightly different, the fronds there coarser, then releasing again. This was not interesting in any conventional sense. It was interesting in the way that the sounds had been interesting, the way the mist had been interesting. Interesting in the sense that she could attend to it indefinitely, without fatigue, without needing it to develop into something else. It was what it was, and she was attending to it, and the cold continued, and the glow continued, and the 3 winds continued above her in their independent layers. Edric exhaled. Long, very long. She listened to the length of it. Time had further loosened. She was not tracking this either, only noticing that she had stopped making any attempt to locate herself within it. Earlier in the evening, in the time she was already having difficulty thinking of as earlier, which had acquired the texture of a different kind of time entirely, she had been aware of duration, of the light decreasing, of the hours passing in some relation to the hours remaining. Now there was only the moss and the cold, and the breath beside her and the glow. She could not have said if they had been in the clearing for an hour, or for 3 hours, or for something between. And the inability to say this was not accompanied by the unease it would ordinarily have been accompanied by. Her shoulders were no longer anything. She meant by this that they were no longer available to her as objects of attention, not because they had disappeared, but because they had dissolved so completely into the general fact of her body being here that they could not be separated out. She was not holding them up. She was not placing them anywhere. They were simply wherever they were, which was where gravity and the shape of her coat and the angle of the stone had placed them, and none of this required her participation. Her hand in the moss, the cold of it, the living texture of it, which was not soft in any simple sense, not soft the way fabric was soft or water was soft, but yielding in the specific way of things that are in the process of being alive, which was a different quality entirely, a quality that had no single word for it, that was somewhere between resilience and accommodation, that meant, I am here, and you are here, and there is room. One of the creatures passed through the far edge of the clearing. She knew this. Not from seeing. She was not looking at the far edge of the clearing. She knew it the way she had known Edric's position, from the warmth at her side, the way she had known the second wind was gathering before she heard it, the way this place had been slowly redistributing what counted as knowing. A peripheral warmth, a brief alteration in the quality of the mist at the far tree line, something she perceived at the level below whatever level observation operated on. It was not remarkable, or it was entirely remarkable, in a way that had become indistinguishable from ordinary. The two had been converging all evening, and had now, here, arrived at the same point. She pressed her palm more firmly into the moss. Not intentionally. The way your hand tightens briefly on something when you are on the edge of sleep, and the body makes one small checking gesture. Not alert, only confirming. Still here. Still here. Then releasing. Edric's hand found the ground beside hers. She did not hear him move it, only became aware, at some point, that there were two hands in the moss where there had been one, his palm down beside hers, a few centimeters away, also pressing slightly into the cold, wet fronds, also in contact with the glow from below. He did not say anything. She did not say anything. Two hands in the moss of a Swedish forest, cold on the backs, cold at the fingers, the glow coming up through the mist below them. That was all, and it was complete in the way a thing can be complete when nothing has been left out that needed to be included. The mist sat low. The moss held the light. The stone held her back with the patience of something that had been doing this, in one form or another, for longer than the forest itself had been a forest. Her breathing arrived and left. She did not follow it anywhere. It simply did what it did, and she was the place where it did it, and the cold was around them both, and the clearing was very still. Chapter 8. The Air Between the Trees. The mist was at her wrists. Not moving, or moving in the way it had always moved, too slowly for the movement to register as movement. It was at her wrists. The cold of it was different from the cold of the air above it, more specific, more close. The cold of something with density. She could feel it on the backs of both hands as a faint, continuous pressure, as though the mist had weight, as though it had been accumulating very slowly over the course of the evening and had arrived here at her wrists, at the place where her hands went into the moss and was resting. She left her hands where they were. The moss below her palms was the same. The glow was the same. The cold coming up through both was the same. She was not comparing these things to how they had been before. The before had become, like most things this evening, difficult to locate with any precision. There was only the present configuration. Wrists in mist, palms in moss, stone at her back, the cold throughout. Edric's hand was still beside hers. The upper wind had stilled. She knew this because the between-sound silence had a different quality now. Not the silence between the wind's passages, but the silence of the wind's absence, the high continuous hiss that had been present since they'd entered the forest. So constant she had long since stopped attending to it, was no longer there. The space it left was not empty. It was the specific shape of what had been there. A negative impression, the way a body leaves a shape in long grass after it has risen, and the grass very slowly returns to where it was. The other sounds continued. The water in the deep forest, the faint breath-like current low along the ground, the near silence between them, her breathing. his breathing. The clearing's breathing, which was, she let the thought move through her without stopping it, the same thing now, the same rate, the same quality of unhurried arrival and release. The creatures were in the trees. She knew this without looking. They had been in the trees for some time, or had been present in some distribution across the space of the clearing and the tree line that included the trees. She could not have said which, and the inability to say did not require resolution. They were where they were. She was where she was. The mist connected the ground between. No warmth moved through the clearing. No arc of light crossed the open air above the moss. Only the steady, unhurried quality of being near, of sharing a space without any particular agenda regarding the sharing. She had the sense, peripheral, low, the kind of sense that arrived from the direction below language, that they had been waiting for this, not for her specifically, not for this evening specifically, only for the clearing to reach this state, which it did apparently, when the conditions were right, and the conditions tonight had been right. The mist pressed gently at her wrists. Her coat had gone cold throughout. Not damp. The cold was dry. The cold of still air held against fabric long enough to work all the way through. She could feel it at the front of her shoulders now, which meant the cold had crossed from the stone at her back to the air at her front and met in the middle, and she was, in the most literal available sense, the temperature of the clearing. She did not register this as a problem. Her legs were heavy against the ground, not the heaviness of fatigue. She had stopped being able to distinguish between what her body was doing and what the clearing was doing to her body, and this was not a distinction she needed to recover. Heavy in the way that the stone was heavy, in the way that the old compressed moss at the root was heavy, dense with the accumulation of many years of cold and wet, and the slow work of being what it was. She was, for now, part of that accumulation. Edric's breathing was very slow. She knew this the way she knew the water in the deep forest, by its continuous, low presence in the texture of everything, not by attending to it, not anymore. His breathing was simply one of the sounds the clearing made, alongside the water and the low current along the ground, and the specific quality of silence between those things. His hand in the moss, her hand in the moss, the cold in both. These were facts of the clearing now, not things belonging to two people sitting in it, but facts of the clearing itself, the same way the glow was a fact, and the mist was a fact, and the old stone was a fact. She and Edric had entered the clearing as things separate from it. Over the course of the evening, that separation had been quietly, unhurriedly revised. The glow beneath the mist had deepened, not brighter. The blue-green was the same blue-green it had always been, steady, internal, unperformative. But the mist covered more of the ground now, and the glow came through all of it, and the effect was that the entire floor of the clearing was a single field of diffused and quiet light. No dark patches, no variation from one route to the next, only the continuous, even luminescence of a thing that had been doing this for a very long time, and saw no reason to do anything different. She was sitting in the middle of it. The light came up through the mist at the level of her hands. Her hands were in it. The cold, the stone at her back, which was cold, which had always been cold, which would continue to be cold, in a way that had nothing to do with her presence or her absence. She had leaned against it, and the cold had come through the wool and into her, and the distinction between her temperature and its temperature had dissolved some time ago, the way the distinction between the moss and her palm had dissolved, the way the distinction between the between sound silence and the sounds themselves had dissolved. She was not cold. She was here. Both of these were true. They had turned out to be, in this clearing, in this light, the same statement. One breath. Long, arriving without effort, the cold air into the lungs, clean, with the faint mineral edge of winter in a northern forest, the trace of something old and damp and still, the chest rising, the ribs expanding, the particular fullness at the top of an unhurried inhale, and then releasing. The air leaving with no urgency, the chest settling, the ribs returning, the body at its most basic accommodation with itself, the taking in and the letting go over and over, in the cold and the quiet, in the blue-green light. Beside her, the same. The trees were very close. They had always been this close. The clearing was not large, and the pines at its edge had always been within easy sight. But close felt different now. Not closer in distance. Closer in the way that things become close when the space between you and them has been filled with something that is not distance anymore. The mist was between her and the trees. The glow was between her and the trees. The long, still evening was between her and the trees. None of these were distances. The bark of the nearest pine was very dark. The lichen on it, pale as old bone. The moss at its roots continued. High above, where the upper wind had been, the branches were still. Completely still, in the way that only very cold, very windless winter air can make branches still. Not the stillness between movements, but the stillness of nothing moving, the deeper rest of a world that had put down everything it was carrying and was simply standing in the cold, in the dark, in the quiet. She was standing in it too, sitting. The distinction had become, like most distinctions this evening, less important than it once was. The mist was at her forearms. She felt the cold of it there, and the slight density. She did not lower her eyes to confirm this. Her eyes were open, directed at the middle distance, at the tree line, at the dark bark and pale lichen, and the moss that glowed at the roots, and she was not looking at any of it specifically. The clearing, the cold, the glow in the ground, coming up through the mist, reaching the level of her hands. Edric beside her, in the same light. The breath, the stone, the clearing. Chapter 9. Moss, light, the quiet after. The mist. The glow through the mist, which was the same glow it had always been, coming from the same place it had always come from, doing the same thing it had always done. The cold. She was not thinking. This was not an achievement. It had not been arrived at. It was simply what remained when everything that had been thinking had over the long course of the evening set itself down somewhere and not returned. The stone at her back, the moss at her palms, the mist at her forearms, at her wrists, at the backs of her hands. Glow. The blue-green of it, which was not blue and not green, which had no name that fit it fully, which had been here in the roots of these trees long before any language that might have named it. From the left root, the right root, from the compressed ancient base of the nearest fronds. Edric's breathing. Long, slow, in and out. Her breathing. Long, slow. The clearing's breathing, which was the same. The water. Somewhere in the deep forest, water crossed stone. The same stone it had always crossed, in the same direction, at the same unhurried pace. She could not hear it now. She knew it was there. The upper branches still. The mist, moving so slowly that moving was not the right word. The glow. One of the creatures was in the nearest tree. She knew this the way she knew everything now, from below the level where knowing and not knowing were separate things. A warmth at the edge, a presence in the air between the branches, 12 or 15 meters above the moss. Not moving, simply there, in the way that the cold was there, and the glow was there, and the stone was there. She did not look up. There was no need to look up. Moss, the fronds beneath her palms, each one still itself, still cold, still alive in the specific way of living things that have been cold for a very long time and have made their accommodation with it. Her fingers in it spread, the cold at each fingertip. Edric's hand beside hers, also in it, also cold, also still. The glow came up through the mist. The mist held the glow. The glow was in the mist, and below the mist, and in the ground below that, in the roots, in the old compressed base of things that had been growing here since before she was born, and would continue growing after. The light did not know she was here. It continued anyway. Her breath. Out. The cold air received. Out. The clearing, the trees at its edge, the dark bark, the pale lichen in the fissures of the bark, spreading in the way it had been spreading for longer than she could hold in her mind. The clearing. The stone, her back against it. The cold that had moved all the way through. The mist, the glow, the two hands in the moss. She did not know when the creatures had gone. She became aware at some point that the warmth at the tree line was no longer there, not absent in a way that felt like departure, only absent in the way that the upper wind was absent, in the way that the before of the evening was absent, things that had been and were no longer, and the space they left was not empty. The glow continued. The mist continued. Moss. Cold. Glow. She became aware, slowly, of grass. Not in the clearing. The clearing was still the clearing, still moss and mist and old stone, still blue-green light at the roots of old pines, but at the edge of her perception, somewhere in the direction of the path, there was grass. Ordinary grass. The kind that grew in the ordinary world, in the late afternoon, without glowing. She did not move toward it, the way she note a sound from another room, aware of it, not yet belonging to it. The glow. From below her hands, through the mist, from the roots. The cold. The stone. Edric's breath beside her. Her breath. At some point, she could not have said at which point, the point had not announced itself, she became aware that she was looking at the tree line, not through peripheral attention, directly. The trees were the trees. The bark was dark and furrowed. The lichen was pale. The moss at the roots was glowing, faintly, the way it had been glowing all evening and would continue to glow after she was gone, in the long cold nights of a Swedish winter that had been doing this since before the words for it existed. She was looking at it directly, and the creatures were not there, and that was all right. Edric moved. A small shift. His hand lifted from the moss. She felt the absence of its warmth beside her hand. Brief, specific, the way the absence of any warmth is specific when you have been near it long enough. He did not stand. He only moved his hand to his knee. She heard the faint sound of his coat, the sound of him returning to himself in some small incremental way. She left her hand in the moss a little longer. The grass was still there at the edge. She could feel it now, the way you feel the near side of a doorway before you step through, present, specific, belonging to a different kind of space. The ordinary afternoon, the path, the world that was on the other side of the trees, which had been there all along, which had not changed. She lifted her hand from the moss. The cold left her palm in stages. First, the deepest cold, from the wettest fronds. Then the surface cold. Then only the fact of having been cold, which faded more slowly. She looked at her palm. It was darker than usual from the moss, faintly stained, the lines of it traced in something fine and earthy that was not quite dirt. She did not wipe it away. They stood. She did not record the standing as an event. It happened, the way breath happened, the way the mist had moved, without announcement. The clearing was still the clearing. The mist, the glow, the stone that had held her for the long course of the evening and was still there, still cold, as it would be tomorrow, as it had been before. She looked at it once. The moss on its surface caught the glow from the roots and gave it back, very slightly. A surface that had absorbed all of this and would say nothing about it. Edric was at the path's edge. She followed. She did not look back immediately. She walked the first few steps on the path with her face forward, the ordinary cold of open air replacing the specific cold of the clearing, the ordinary dark of a winter evening in the north replacing the mist-diffused glow. The path was firm underfoot. The trees on either side were the same trees they had been on the way in. Then she stopped. She turned. The clearing was visible through the last trees, the mist still low, the glow still rising through it, blue-green and steady, asking nothing. The path curved away from it. The forest stood. She looked for a moment. Then she turned back and walked on. Her footsteps on the path, when she reached the open ground, were quieter than they had any reason to be.